Greetings and welcome. Today we will be exploring meter, simple meter and compound meter. We'll begin by taking a look at the word meter here. Meter is a pattern of accented and unaccented beats. A pattern of 2 would be duple meter, 1, 2. Pattern of 3 would be triple meter, 1, 2, 3. And a pattern of 4 would be quadruple meter, 1, 2, 3, 4. Today, instead of counting by numbers, we're going to count by Joes. And so that would mean we'd have 4 Joes per bar. Joe, 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 Joe. Now, in simple meters, we divide the beat into 2 parts. And for that, we're going to solicit the help of Joe's son. Joseph, let me introduce you. Here's Joe and Joseph. Joe is twice the size of Joseph. Joseph has to walk twice as fast as Joe to cover the same distance. So if we have a series of Joes, they sound like this. Joe, 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 Joe. That poor little Joseph has to go Joseph, 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 Joseph to keep up. Yes? Here's a series of Joes and Josephs as a rhythm, and it would sound like this. Joe, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, 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 Joe. Your turn. Joe, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, 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 Joe. Excellent. Okay. How many Joes did we have here? 8. Okay. Now if you were to divide them into even groupings, we would have, if we were to divide the Joes into groups of 2s, a duple group, duple meter, we'd have 4 groups of 2s. Joe, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, 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 Joe. If we did it as groups of 4s, quadruple grouping, we'd have 2 groups of Joes. Joe, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, 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 Joe. Okay, so the key point here to remember that in simple meter, our beat, Joe, can be subdivided into 2 parts. Joseph, 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 Joseph. In contrast, in compound meter, we divide the beat into 3 parts. And for that, we're going to solicit the help of Josephine. So our beat would be Joe, 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 Joe. Dividing into 3 parts, it would become Josephine, 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 Josephine. And here's Josephine Baker, quite a star. Now here we have Joe, Joe, Josephine, Josephine, Joe, Joe, Josephine, Joe. How many Joes do we have? Well, if we divide them into equal groups, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In compound duple, we'd have 4 groups of Joes. Joe, Joe, Josephine, Josephine, Joe, Joe, Josephine, Joe. That would be compound duple. Compound quadruple, we'd have Joe, Joe, Josephine, Josephine, Joe, Joe, Josephine, Joe. And now for a little fun. I'd like you to compose a simple 2-bar rhythm using Joe and Joseph in simple quadruple meter. So remember, simple quadruple will be dividing the beat into 2 parts. So we'll have Joe and Joseph. Here's an example. Joe, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, Joe. Then below, after you've written your sequence there with 8 Joes, 2 bars, then below, write the equivalent note. So Joe would be a quarter note, Joseph would be 2/8 notes. Each eighth note gets half a beat, as you know. So this would be Joe, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, Joe. Okay? After you complete that, then I'd like you to take that same composition and transform it into compound quadruple. So here is our example. Just a moment ago we did Joe, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, Joe. And all I did here was I substituted Josephine. And here we have, now it becomes Joe, Joe, Josephine, Joe, Josephine, Joe, Josephine, Joe. Yes? One more time, let's try it. Joe, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, Joe, Joseph, Joe. That's simple quadruple meter. Compound quadruple. Joe, Joe, Josephine, Joe, Josephine, Joe, Josephine, Joe. Okay, hope that you have some fun. Thank you very much.